Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. First of all, I would like to thank you for the kind invitation. Of course, I have only less than half an hour time to talk about Pierre Sarkar's quite challenging concept of Microvita. But in this short time, I must give you first a short survey about what we understand by vacuum and space. Space has been discussed since times immemorial, but let me start with René Descartes, who understood space as a category, because as a philosophical realist, he was able to see categories as something existing in the objective world. In our times, however, we think that categories exist only in our human minds, because we have forgotten the position of philosophical realists, who took it as granted that these universals exist in reality beyond mere thought and speech. Now later, Newton denied that space is a category. Rather, he took space as an object, which he called the void, and to which he assigned a mathematical structure, namely that of Euclidean space. Even later, Einstein denied the Euclidean structure of space and showed that space can be deformed by masses contained therein. In fact, it can be deformed dramatically so that its homogeneity and linearity is lost and curvatures result, which are now known as the invisible structure of space-time. Even later, Georges Lemaitre, a Belgian priest and physicist, demonstrated to the scientific community that space is neither eternal nor absolute, but must have started a long time ago. And indeed it was found that space started about 13.8 billion years ago from a tiny area of quantum fluctuations filled with an enormous amount of energy. And in that small volume, the energy was at such a high density, temperature and pressure that its volume expanded rapidly in a phase of inflation, so that after quite a short time, the universe reached a volume close to its present size. Now these vacuum fluctuations, which were the starting point of our universe, they existed not only at the beginning, rather they exist even today, but now they are found only at the subatomic level. Here you see an animation, and we can see how virtual particles are supposed to pop up from and disappear again into nothingness. And if we could go to even higher magnifications, towards the range of Planck length, we would see that even space particles are constantly popping up from and going back to so-called nothingness. Next topic is mental space. What is mental space? Usually we think of mental space as something existing only in the mind of humans. And we think that mental space is created by our brains, by the white and gray matter of our brains. So when we think and when we see an object in the external world, this object will be reflected in our mind, in our mental space. And for such reflections, there is a computer model which simulates the same. It's a very simple model. It consists only of two entries and two exits. The entries signify the sensory organs, and the exits signify the motor organs. And in between there are only four nodes which are able to interconnect among each other, but which are also able to produce signals on their own. So, in the beginning, the interactions within this network are of course really chaotic. But after about 30,000 cycles, there will be the formation of a pattern. And as soon as such a pattern stabilizes, the model predicts that this is a sign of the emergence of consciousness. And the emergence of these patterns can be measured by a phi value, which is a metric for effective group collaboration. So in this model, it is not only applicable to brains, not only applicable to nervous systems, but it is also applicable to groups of people and to networks of computers, or other living beings like plants, and even to fungi interacting among each other. And because of its generality, integrated information theory has lots of applications. However, it's not able to explain any subjective experience. It is able to explain the reflections of external objects in the internal world, in mental space, but it cannot explain the subjective feeling. The impression of smelling a flower, for example, the experience of seeing a red rose, or the feeling of being something, as Thomas Nagel was putting it, something like a bat, for example. In philosophy, these subjective experiences are called qualia, as opposed to the properties of the external world. As I said, IIT has lots of applications. It is not limited to humans, as it tries to explain the emergence of consciousness. And as it is so general, it has also been linked to panpsychism, which advocates the idea of consciousness being everywhere, throughout the whole universe. But of course, IIT can only apply its algorithms if there are re-entry mechanisms. It works on the basis of re-entries. So what is panpsychism? Panpsychism holds that mental activity is a fundamental and ubiquitous feature of the whole universe, and that all entities, including inanimate objects, possess some form of consciousness or mind. In the beginning of our modern times, in the 14th, 15th, and 16th century, there were quite a number of philosophers who used imaginary space as a means to enable panpsychism. Due to lack of time, I cannot go into the details of this table, but you see that they have used imaginary space under various aspects with various emphasis and importance. In the West, the last proponent of this tradition was the German polymath Leibniz. He was a contemporary of Newton, and in opposition to him, he advocated panpsychism, believing that the universe is made up of an infinite number of simple substances, which he called monads, with each monad being made of one metaphysical point, not a physical, but a metaphysical point, surrounded by an imaginary sphere. And this metaphysical point was supposed to project its perceptions and wants, the wants which he called conatus, onto this imaginary sphere. After Leibniz, the idea of panpsychism lost its importance in the West, whereas it remained relevant in India. In India, throughout these centuries, panpsychism continued to be accepted in society, and one of the most important proponents of modern panpsychism was Prabhat Ranjan Sarkar, who also held that the universe is filled with consciousness and that consciousness is present in dormant form even in inanimate objects. But in this general form, it doesn't have any relevance for scientists. So he wrote this booklet for the scientists, Microvita in a nutshell, so that they may reintegrate panpsychism into our modern science. I cannot summarize it here in this short introduction, but I can show you the conclusion. At the end of the booklet, he presents a table which is called the four-chamber model. It consists of 2 rows and 2 lines. The rows denote for subjective and objective, these opposites have already been discussed. It's about qualia on the subjective and quiddities on the objective side. But the question now is, what does he mean with the lines, which means by the terms complemented and reduced? For this, it is helpful to consider Aristotle's distinction between potentiality and actuality. In fact, these terms are used in probability theory, where there are spaces of probabilities and spaces of actualities. So in the case of dice, out of 6, only 1 appears in the space of actualities. And of course, the probability by which this occurs is 1 to 6. Applying this to the 4-chamber model, we see that the complemented states are the possible and the reduced ones are the actual states. And we can distinguish subjective and objective possibilities as well as subjective and objective actualities. Regarding Microvita, I would summarize that space is supposed to be equipped not only with objective but also with subjective dimensions, and that there are entities, which he calls Microvita, which allow for interaction between its subjective actualities and its objective possibilities. Of course, there are interactions also between the other chambers, but those between the subjective actualities and the objective possibilities are of the main importance. Now, to give you an example, for the emergence of consciousness, we need self-references. And the simplest case of self-reference is depicted in this small formula, where 1 multiplied by I gives I, and I multiplied by minus I gives, again, 1. Completing a circle which can be repeated again and again. Putting it into words, we can say that the quiddity of some objective existence is perceived as a quale, and in return this quale is projected onto its existence. Consequently, this circle can become a feedback loop which will produce some rudimentary form of self-awareness. In the next step, we have 4 positions: 1, I, minus 1, minus I. Note that here, in opposition to the previous example, the operator remains the same. It's not changing. It's always plus I, the multiplying factor. So we may ask, what is the importance of this? Does it have any relevance? Does it have anything to do with our lives, and how does it feel? Well, we are talking about space, but how space feels, does it feel? Yes, it does. Because we feel space when we breathe. When we breathe in, we feel an expansion. And when we breathe out, we feel a contraction. So with closed eyes, we can breathe in, and we feel the expansion. And when we breathe out, we feel the contraction. And in numbers, this is represented by the same cycle. Inhalation is objective, exhalation is also objective. But the sensation of inhalation and exhalation is subjective. And so this goes in the same cycle. Consequently, we can say that qualia and quiddities do matter, because qualia are our subjective experiences and quiddities are the essential properties. But does it make sense to highlight this small difference? Yes, it makes sense, because it is the foundation of what we call consciousness. Also, it's an example of how a very small difference can become significant after repetitions, after many re-entries. This phenomenon is called the butterfly effect, a term that was coined in 1972, and even earlier, Marcel Duchamp An artist who was very much interested in scientific achievements had coined the term informations, which denotes the same. Very small differences can have huge effects, especially in transitions from subjective to objective and return. Yes, these differences are important for Microvita, and they are of particular relevance in the study of contingency. So whenever we see something which is supposed to happen randomly or by chance, we can consider that in fact it might have happened due to Microvita, because Microvita embodies something which is usually left out completely. That is teleodynamics, which means that final causes can occur, although they are usually excluded from scientific considerations. Scientific considerations are usually focused on material and effective causes only, whereas final causes are excluded. But Microvita allow their reintegration into scientific discussions. So these ideas have been laid out in one of our articles, which was published a year ago in an Indian paper. We also had quite a number of conferences and seminars in the last 2 decades, and we released 2 books on the same topics. Additionally, there are 2 books which I would like to recommend. One is Much Ado About Nothing by Edward Grant, and the other is Panpsychism in the West by David Skrbina. And there are 2 articles which you can find in the internet. One is Matter Conscious? And the other is Quantum Mechanics and Consciousness by Valia Allori, where she also tries, as we did, to solve the hard problem of consciousness along the lines of panpsychism. Many thanks for your attention. If you have questions, I may try to answer them now.